Hello, everybody. Welcome to our very first speed build. So, what we're going to be building today is a mausoleum from the Sunder Nursery in Delhi, in India, which was previously known as the Azim Bagh. It's located right next to Humayun's tomb, which, if you watched our first episode, is the centerpiece of our zoo. The building that I'm making today is called the Lakkarwala Burj, and it was built in the 1500s. Since these buildings that I'm making are so old, I really wanted to know what importance they had in today's world. So I found this really interesting article that talks about what meanings old Mughal sites, the buildings, the architecture have in Lahore, Pakistan, which was the capital of the Mughal Empire for a few centuries. The buildings that are still around today occupy this really cool and contradictory place in the minds of people there. The first set of stories told about these sites connects to the origins of Pakistan, first as an idea and then as a country in the 1940s. One of the most important things for all nation states or countries is creating a shared sense of history. And what that does is it gives people a shared identity and a way to relate to each other and the government in a meaningful way. What ended up happening is that these buildings got tied into this story of why Pakistan exists in the first place. And according to its independence movement, that was for it to be a state independent from India, formed to protect Muslim people, their interests, and culture. So, the most important part for Pakistani national identity was to differentiate itself from India. Now, India has a lot of Mughal architecture itself, like the Taj Mahal, and in the popular consciousness, Mughal architecture is associated with India. So, how do you actually go about differentiating Pakistan's identity from India's? They ended up finding this thread of victimization of Muslims by non Muslims in these buildings because when you walk through them, you actually see the destruction caused to them under Sikh and British rule in the past. So you have this physical representation of this idea that there is a need to protect Muslims from non Muslim rulers or leaders. On the other hand, you have this public opinion about the state of ruin that these buildings are in, and it comes to represent the ineptitude of the government. So, this is a very different take on what these buildings mean versus what the government portrays. So, there's also these many cases of the government promising to reconstruct and conserve these sites that have gone unfulfilled in addition to cases where they fumbled and lost funding from international sources to do so. On top of that, the government gives permission to public events like concerts and dinners to be held in these buildings, and that brings in a lot of money, but it also does additional damage to the sites. All of these things give additional meanings to the Mughal sites for the public. So, one of the really interesting examples that the author brings up about this kind of conundrum of, on the one hand, ruins and being ruined is important and meaningful, but then on the other hand, it's a problem, is a letter to the editor from one of the newspapers. So this person wrote, during the Sikh period, Islamic monuments of Lahore were ruthlessly destroyed, mutilated, and deprived of their elegance. When the British came, they too had their share in destroying the Islamic monuments. Sikhs have now gone, so have the British, but their traditions survive with full potency. Since 1947, a large number of monuments have completely disappeared, while others have been sacrificed, destroyed, and transmuted either in the name of conservation or restoration or to make room for urban expansion. The present condition of the historical structures indicates that we are not paying due attention to them. The non Muslims tried to wipe off the specimens of our culture, but they could not. Why should we be apathetic towards them? So, yeah, lots of ideas that are full of contradiction and tension. And that's what makes these kind of stories really interesting. All countries will have these kind of contentious, contradictory stories. But in the end, you have this really weird conundrum where you have, on the one hand, this shared sense of identity around the fact that these Mughal buildings were partially destroyed, but at the same time, that destruction represents the failure of the government to protect its history and heritage, which was its purpose from the beginning. So you get to the point where if the government actually fixes the destruction of these buildings, they alleviate people's concerns, but they put in jeopardy the shared identity of victimization that the buildings represent. So it's a really complex issue, and I found it really interesting. And then in today's world, these buildings have found new importance in relationship to modernization and the relationships between Pakistan and Europe, the USA, and the Middle East, which threatens local identities. So these cultural sites are once again becoming important ways to make a sense of national identity for real people in their everyday lives. One of the really interesting things and useful things that you can actually take out of this article is that these kind of contradictory stories about nationalism and belonging and what it means to be a member of a country, you can kind of pick them apart no matter where you go and find some really interesting and contradictory things happening. So, in your own everyday lives, pay attention to the stories that you're being told about what it means to belong where you are. Look for these contradictions, and also, more importantly, look for the things that are missing. Look for the groups of people who aren't represented in these stories. Because if you figure out the groups of people who are missing from these stories of belonging in a country, you'll probably figure out which groups of people are getting discriminated against. You'll probably figure out what groups of people aren't getting funding from the government, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, I got all of this information from this really cool article called Locations of Longing: The Ruins of Old Lahore by Dr. Saleema Waraich. And in the article, there's even more detailed. It was a really great read. I hope you enjoyed my little summary of it. It's also listed in the description if you want to check it out. Um, I'm not sure how accessible it is. It might be behind a paywall, but if you have access to libraries or university libraries, I'm sure there's a way to get a hold of it. So, yeah, I have no more left to share. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to leave you with the rest of the speed build. Hopefully, there's some interesting things that I do in the build that can be helpful for you. And yeah, bye.